Toups Graphics presents Mastering the Staar Test, 6th grade math. Today we'll learn how to convert fractions to decimals to percents. Remember, a fraction is a division problem. 5 over 8 means 5 divided by 8. Remember, when you divide, the numerator goes inside and the denominator goes outside. We need to divide the denominator into the numerator. Since 8 will not divide into 5, we need to add a decimal with a few zeros to perform the division process. And finally, to make your fraction an equivalent decimal, you would do the division. 8 would go into 5 625,000 times. Some important things to note. Half of 8 would be 4. 4 over 8 would be 5/10 or half. Notice that 5/8 is more than 4/8, so the equivalent decimal is more than 5/10. Now that we remember to make a fraction into an equivalent decimal you divide, let's talk about percents. What is a percent? A percent is a ratio that compares a number to 100. For example, 50% would mean 50 out of 100. This could be turned into the fraction or ratio of 50 over 100. By dividing 50 over 100 by the GCF of 50, you would get the equivalent ratio of 1/2. That means 50% is the same as 1/2, and we all remember that 1/2 is equal to 5/10. We just turned 50% into the equivalent ratio of 1/2, which equals the equivalent decimal of 5/10. Now let's take another percent. Let's take 75%. That means it's 75 out of 100. 75% could be written as a ratio of 75 over 100. If you divide by the GCF of 25, you would simplify 75 over 100 to 3 over 4. That means 75% is the same as 3/4. If you divide 3 by 4, you get 75 hundredths. 75% would be 3/4, which would also be 75 hundredths. Now it's your turn. You need to convert 35% to a fraction and a decimal. Some questions to answer are: Question 1. What number is used as the denominator when making 35% a fraction? Number 2. What is the GCF when simplifying the fraction? Number 3. What is the simplified fraction? And lastly, what will the equivalent decimal be? Pause the video until you have the questions answered. Remember, 35% means 35 out of 100. A percent means you're comparing the number to 100. You would put 35 over 100 to make your fraction. You would divide by the GCF of 5. That would give you the simplified fraction of 7/20. If you divide 20 into 7, you would get the equivalent decimal of 35 hundredths. 35% would be the same as 7/20, which would also be the same as 35 hundredths. Now let's look at some characteristics of percents and decimals. Let's look at the percents and decimals we've done so far. 35% would be 35 hundredths, 75% would be 75 hundredths, and 50% would be 5/10. An easy way to think of going from percents to decimals, since there are 100 pennies in a dollar, you could think of making percents into pennies to turn them into decimals. That's what we did with 35%, 75%, and 50%. 35% would be 35 pennies, 75% would be 75 pennies, 50% would be 50 pennies, but we don't need the zero in the hundreds place. Now it's your turn. See if you can turn the following percents into decimals. Think of turning the percents into pennies. "45% would be 0.45 or 4,500. 25% would be 2,500 or 0.25. 70% would be 70 hundredths. You don't need the last zero, so it would turn into 7 tenths. Now it's time for a word from our sponsors. Do you need to convert a percent to a fraction? You'll need to use the number 100 and the GCF. The first thing you'll do is to put 40% over the special number of 100. That will turn 40% into the ratio of 40 over 100. Now that you've used 100 to make a ratio, you need to use the GCF to simplify the ratio. The GCF of 40 and 100 is 20. 20 will be used to simplify the ratio of 40 over 100. To simplify the ratio of 40 over 100, you need to divide by the GCF of 20. That would turn your ratio of 40 over 100 into the simplified ratio of 2/5. Using the number 100 and the GCF, we've turned 40% into the simplified ratio of 2/5. The number 100 and the GCF. It will help you turn any percent into a simplified ratio. Another way to learn about percents is to model it. A 10 by 10 grid can be used to model a percent. For instance, to model 60%, you would use a 10 by 10 grid because it has 100 squares and shade in 60 of the 100 squares. By using the model, you could visualize and see that 60% shades in more than half or 50% of your model. You could also use the model to show that 60% would take up the same amount of space as 3/5. 60% as a fraction would be 3/5. Now let's take a look at some common fraction, decimal, percent conversions that you should have memorized. Our first fraction will be 1/2. 1/2 would be 5/10 as a decimal, which would also be 50%. 1/2 is 5/10 and also 50%. Next up, we have the fraction 1/3. 1/3 as a decimal is 33 hundredths and 1/3. And if you change that to a percent, you get 33 1/3%. Next up, we have the fraction of 2/3. 2/3 is 66 hundredths and 2/3 as a decimal, and 66 2/3 as a percent. Continuing our all-star fraction lineup, we have 1/4. It's 25 hundredths as a decimal and 25%. Next in the fraction lineup is 3/4. That's 75 hundredths as a decimal, and as a percent, it's 75%. Now the fraction lineup gives you the fifths: 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, and 4/5. To make fifths into decimals, you need to remember 2/10. Every fifth is 2/10. 1/5 is 2/10, 2/5 is 4/10, 3/5 is 6/10, and 4/5 is 8/10. And to convert the decimals to percents, you need to remember 20s. 1/5 is 20%, 2/5 is 40%, 3/5 is 60%, and 4/5 is 80%. And now, introducing those pesky 8s. 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, and 7/8. Your 8s as decimals are 1/8 is 125 thousandths, 3/8 is 375 thousandths, 5/8 is 625 thousandths, and 7/8 is 875 thousandths. And as percents, 1/8 would be 12 5/10%, 3/8 would be 37 5/10%, 5/8 would be 62 and 5/10%. And 7/8 would be 87 and 5/10%. And to finish our 6th grade fraction lineup, we bring you the tenths. 1/10, 3/10, 7/10, and 9/10. Your tenths as decimals are 1/10 is 1/10, 3/10 is 3/10, 7/10 is 7/10, and 9/10 is 9/10. And as percents, 1/10 would be 10%, 3/10 would be 30%, 7/10 would be 70%, and 9/10 would be 90%. Now let's talk about the percent to decimal and decimal to percent rule. The key in this rule is to remember the number 100. Since 100 has 1, 2, 0, the rule is to move the decimal 2 times. Let's use the rules with percent. Let's change 5% and 87 and 5/10% to decimals. Let's start with 5%. We need to move the decimal 1, 2. If you move the decimal 2 places to the left, you have an open space. We must insert a 0 in the open space. Remember also to think of money. 5% would be 5 pennies, which you would write as 5 hundredths. Now let's look at 87 and 5/10%. We need to move the decimal 1, 2 times to the left. That would turn 87 and 5/10% into the equivalent decimal of 875 thousandths. And lastly, to convert a decimal to a percent, you would move the decimal 2 times, but not to the left, to the right. To make 3/10 a decimal, you would move the decimal to the right 1, 2 times. This would create an open spot between the 3 and the decimal place, which we would fill in with a 0. 3/10 would be the same as 30%. Remember, to change a percent to a decimal, move the decimal place 2 places to the left. To change a decimal to a percent, move the decimal 2 places to the right. In summary, a percent is a ratio comparing a number to 100. To make a percent a fraction, you need to remember to use the number 100 and the GCF. Put the percent over 100 and use the GCF to simplify. To change percents and decimals, you need to remember the number 2. To make a percent a decimal, move the decimal 2 places to the left. To make a decimal a percent, move the decimal 2 places to the right. A percent can also be modeled. It can be modeled by using a 10 by 10 grid and shading in the pieces equal to the percent. And there are some common fraction decimal percent conversions you should have memorized. You should have memorized your halves, thirds, fourths, fifths, eighths, and tenths as a 6th grader. Today's video has been sponsored by the number 100. Do you need to work with percents? You need 100. This video has been produced by Toups Graphics. Toups Graphics. Always believe.